welcome to Connect and Collaborate. I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer. And this week, we are talking economic development. And yesterday we had Crown Castle on with us. We did a little bit of talking about internet connections. So that's going to tie in nicely with today's theme. I have with me Rebecca Laurie, who's the Director of Communications for DORA, Colorado.
It's a tongue twister.
It is, a little bit. So Rebecca joins us once every month to bring us different departments, but our show topic today is bringing broadband to the state, which is exciting. So Rebecca, if you want to introduce your guests for us,
absolutely. Thank you so much, Alex. It's always great to be here. Yeah. As you mentioned, we do like to come on once a month to talk about different issues in terms of what types of regulations affect the marketplace and bring experts onto the show to demystify regulatory processes.
Right.
We also like to bring experts in the field to discuss really important initiatives that are happening throughout the state too that may affect the Department of Regulatory Agencies as well as other state agencies that are intrinsically involved in these initiatives. And so I'm so happy that we have two really key guests here today to talk the ever important topic of broadband and bringing broadband to the state. So we have Tony Neal Graves. He is the Executive Director of the Colorado Broadband Office within the Colorado Office of Information Technology. Last year, the governor, he appointed Tony as the executive director to lead the broadband office, and he's responsible for driving the state's broadband strategy, utilizing strong public and private sector relationships in communities across the state to support broadband expansion throughout Colorado. We're really glad to have Tony here with us in the state driving this initiative. He comes to us from Intel Corporation, from the private sector, as well as from the communications industry, working at AT&T, Bell Laboratories, and Lucent Technologies.
So you've got some good experience.
Yeah, I've been around a bit.
Just around a bit. Then we also have with us Jordan Beezley. He's the Director of Broadband Development of the Broadband Fund at the Department of Regulatory Agencies. Jordan serves as essentially directing the Broadband Development Board, which Jordan will talk about a little bit later, which is housed under DORA. And the Broadband Development Board was created to implement and administer the deployment of broadband service in unserved areas of the state by awarding grants from the Broadband Fund.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we want to start out big to talk about just a broad overview of broadband. You know, why do we have broadband now? Why do we need broadband now? Why is it such a priority? So, Tony, could you highlight for us why the state of Colorado, you know, really established this priority for broadband deployment and ultimately the broadband office?
Cool. Well, thank you, first of all, I'm really happy to be here today. And, you know, I've been in this role now for about a year, and the governor created this office. And what he was looking for at that point in time was more coordination across a variety of state agencies. And we've been on a journey in this state in terms of trying to get broadband across the state. And you've got, you know, activities within the Department of Local Affairs. You've got the Office of Economic Development, International Trade, Department of Regulatory Agencies, even the Department of Transportation, all of who have been touching this issue and kind of involved. And what we really were trying to do is pull it all together to get more focus on it. Mm-hmm. And I think anybody that has been exposed to broadband understands how important it is. And the analogy that I use is that this is really the equivalent of electricity being accessible to everyone in rural Colorado back in the last century, or universal phone service. It's that next level of connectivity that folks have to have in order to be part of the economy in this century.
Well, absolutely. So if you don't mind, I'll jump in.
No, feel free.
One of the bigger things that we have to worry about, right, is our rural communities' education. So there's schools these days utilize the internet all the time, right? So you need the internet access out in our rural communities, and this is the best way to get it to them. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. If you think about the way the school systems have moved now, they've digitized a lot of the standardized tests that they use for their students, and they have an expectation that they're going to go online to do their homework. And in the rural parts of the state, you're struggling with the issue that they don't have strong connectivity sometimes to the school, and then if the children don't have access to broadband in their home, they literally can't do their homework. And so when we think about, accessing the internet, we have to think about it in terms of what people are trying to do in terms of real productivity versus how we've all thought about broadband, which is about content consumption and accessing movies and things like that.
Sure. So it's not just about watching Netflix, which is what we were talking about.
Absolutely.
It certainly is a lot more. So, but ultimately, that encapsulates why broadband is important. What other areas make broadband so important, and particularly for rural communities? I think here in the metro area, we're so used to just having this immediate connectivity. What are some of the challenges that the rural areas are facing in terms of broadband connectivity? And what are some of the things that your office and Jordan, you'll talk about the fund, are doing to overcome those challenges?
Well, we mentioned education, but if you think about any aspect of your life, another example that I use all the time is employment. When's the last time that you've applied for a job with a paper application? The expectation that almost every company has now, that if you're going to apply for a job, that you're going to go online and fill out their application online. The government, at the state level, we're trying to digitize access to all of our services in terms of just getting a driver's license, whether or not you can get a hunting license. All of those things are going to be put online, and if you don't have access, you can't participate in that. Another area that we don't talk about very often is public safety. Most of our public safety folks today carry around a radio and multiple other devices that they use in the execution of their job. If they don't have good connectivity, they can't use it. So it really is kind of a thread to just about everything that we do. And that's why I think it's so tightly linked to this overall theme of economic development. I don't see how any community can grow and be part of this economy if you don't have that connectivity.
Jordan, let's talk a little bit about the fund and how that fits into this picture.
Great. So the Broadband Fund is a grant program that was created as part of a telecom package that passed the legislature in 2014. The program is designed to support the deployment of broadband infrastructure into unserved areas of Colorado by providing the capital necessary to actually expand those broadband networks. Grants from our Broadband Fund are actually awarded by a 16-member broadband deployment board. That board is appointed by the governor and various leaders in the legislature. It's made up of about half industry folks and half public representatives, as well as state and local government representatives, who are all experts in the field and provide a great perspective on broadband and really do a great service to the state of Colorado in administering this Broadband Fund grant program. Funding for our grant program actually comes from the high cost support mechanism, which is a 2.6% surcharge on everybody's telephone bill. Those funds have historically gone to support rural telephone service, but over the past several years, we are gradually transitioning that fund from supporting rural telephone service to supporting the deployment of broadband infrastructure into unserved areas in Colorado. And the goal of the program in utilizing all of those funds is to ensure that every household in Colorado has access to at least one provider of broadband services. I see our program really fitting in quite well with all of the programs that Tony oversees, as well as some of the programs that the Colorado Department of Local Affairs has. And they have a great grant program as well that provides funds to local governments for regional broadband plans, as well as local government broadband networks. And so kind of all of these programs together, I think, are moving us towards really the governor's ultimate goal of having 100% broadband coverage in the state.
And what is the coverage at this throughout the state at now? What is that percentage?
In terms of rural households, which is the metric that we're focused on, we're currently at 77% of rural households have access to broadband. And our definition of broadband is the FCC definition, which is 25 megabits to your home.
Okay.
And we're pretty bullish now that we've really got a funding mechanism in place that we can move that towards the 100% objective that we have by 2020.
So that's the goal, 2020, 100%.
That's correct.
And what this looks like in real numbers is we estimate there's about 150,000 rural households that currently lack service. And so with our program, our goal is to get service to all 150,000 of those households.
And so what does that entail when you say get service to? What's the process that must happen for that service ultimately to exist?
Yeah, let me kind of back up a little bit and kind of explain why we have the problem.
Mm-hmm.
The reason we struggle with rural broadband is an issue of population density and topology. I mean, Colorado is a very interesting state in terms of a huge plains area on the east side of the state and huge mountains on the west side. And the reason that we don't have broadband services everywhere in the state is that it's very expensive to reach areas that don't have a lot of population and maybe, over a mountain pass, for example. And so the first thing you have to do is kind of understand that challenge. And what the grant program does is to work with the private sector to try to offset some of that cost, capital costs, for building out that infrastructure into those communities. And one of the things that Jordan mentioned was that the Department of Local Affairs for the last 4 years has also been investing in broadband infrastructure on the municipal and county side. They can give money to local communities to build out what we call middle mile. And the way to think about that is just getting a big pipe into that community. Once we get that pipe into the community, then we can use the grant program within DORA to do the last mile to get the broadband to the individual households.
Typically, what does it take to get a pipe in?
Oh, that's an interesting question. The challenge that we have, again, is, if you think about a lot of areas in the state, is that, the terrain is very difficult. And if you want to run a big pipe, typically what you want to run is fiber. And to run that fiber in, either you have to put it in the ground or you have to run it along utility or telephone poles. And if it's in the ground, it's typically very expensive to dig those trenches to get the pipe, get that fiber into that community. If you're running along the utility lines, typically the issue that we run into is whether or not we have the appropriate easement rights to access that property to put the cable through. So those are the kinds of challenges that we're faced with in making sure that it happens.
And the reason I ask that question is because I think a lot of us are so used to switching on a switch. And we have power lines. Mm-hmm. And so we just assume that being able to get any kind of service that would provide some sort of electricity per se should be fairly simple because the infrastructure is there. But the fact is that the infrastructure is not technically there for this type of service. And so what you're saying is that it takes a lot, very similar to laying down cable lines. So many efforts to lay down cable lines, the same type of effort has to happen with broadband. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. We actually had, it's kind of a blessing for us that we have a lot of rural electric companies that serve our communities, the co-ops, and they do have a lot of infrastructure. But the utility lines and where they run them, the easements that they were granted over private land were for utility services only. And broadband is viewed as a communication service. Okay. And so therefore that's where we get into trouble in terms of making sure we have the access to that private land for that. So that is a challenge for us.
And when we're working with some of our grantees, these are a lot of the challenges that we have to overcome. And one of the things that we do with our grant program is we fund projects that utilize all different types of technologies, and we really work with the providers and the local communities to identify which technologies are going to be best for a particular project in a particular area of the state. For example, out on the Eastern Plains, a lot of the projects that we funded have been wireless projects because you don't have the mountains that are going to get in the way of those signals, and it's relatively cost-effective to serve a relatively low population density. However, we've also funded projects that in certain areas have used fiber to the premise because it is cost-effective because the applicant either already has the rights of way to utilize those existing poles that are in place, or there's other infrastructure that they can piggyback off of that makes that cost effective.
Okay, well, I wanted to ask specifically about the infrastructure. So one of the big reasons that we love Colorado so much is that it's beautiful here, right? So we're talking about these new infrastructures. Is that going to upset that at all? You mentioned the piggybacking off of, say, towers, I would imagine, things like that. Getting this pipe in, is that going to affect any of these beautiful areas?
Not really,
Okay.
because if you think about it, if anywhere that we trench, typically you trench along state highways and things like that. It's the right of way, and so once you bury it in the ground, you don't even know it's there.
Okay.
Most of the time, the only reason you would know that there's any fiber in the ground is if you drive along. Every once in a while, you'll see these little orange poles kind of sticking out of the ground.
Yeah.
That's sort of indicating you that there's actually fiber in the ground there.
Okay.
And in terms of towers, there's already a lot of tower infrastructure that exists within the state. If you think about it in terms of our traditional mobile wireless services that we get as well. And so, it's something that we're kind of used to having. The challenge that we do run into, though, is that there are areas of the state that are federal land. And so, therefore, it's very difficult to get the permitting and things like that to put towers in those areas where it might be very advantageous for coverage.
Right.
But because it's federal land and we're trying to preserve it, you really have to go through a lot of a review in order to put new infrastructure in those areas.
And even towers and other infrastructure that aren't on federal lands,
Right.
they still have to follow all of the county regulations that would be in place to protect various interests, including environmental interests.
Oh, okay.
So, in terms of the fund, can you give a little bit of background of when it was launched and some of the projects that were funded right out of the gate?
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned earlier, the fund was created in 2014. However, we didn't get the first round of grant funding out the door until 2016. In 2016, we were able to award $2.4 million to 8 different projects around the state. That was actually then followed up by another grant cycle in 2017 that just concluded this winter. We were able to award an additional $9.5 million to about 8 projects through that grant cycle. All of those projects in total have served about 13,000 rural households in Colorado, and that's in all corners of the state. And those projects have impacted 22 different counties in Colorado. We've hit, east up and down the Eastern Plains. We've had projects in the San Luis Valley, as well as up in North Park and the Central Mountains of Colorado, and out on the Western Slope as well. And kind of looking forward, again, we're using some of these projects and some of the experience that we've had in these first 2 grant cycles to kind of refine our processes looking forward to really ensure that we're utilizing these funds as best we can and to be as cost effective as we can as we're deploying this infrastructure and working with some of our partners. And so part of what we're doing with this grant cycle, and every time we conclude a grant cycle, is re-examining what we've done and how we can make the process better moving forward, both through talking to stakeholders as well as community members that are impacted by the program and the grantees that are ultimately awarded funds through the program.
And can you give an example of a grantee? Who typically is applying for these grant funds?
Yeah, so grant funds are available to internet service providers that are either for-profit companies or nonprofit rural electric cooperatives or rural telephone cooperatives. So they're not available to local governments or nonprofit entities. The folks that apply for our grants are companies and organizations of all different sizes. So we have very small companies that serve very particular communities coming in applying for grants, as well as some of the big national telecom carriers that come in and apply for our grants as well. In addition, this past grant cycle, we've actually awarded 3 grants to 3 separate rural electric cooperatives. And those are in the San Luis Valley, out on the eastern plains, and also on the western slope. And so the funds that have been awarded have gone to companies of all different sizes throughout Colorado.
And so, Tony, can you talk a little bit more about, I think about, for example, how broadband, certainly wireless service, can help agricultural communities, help people run their businesses in small towns. What else does broadband provide that just they are saying, you know what, we need this, we don't have it, get it here as quickly as possible?
Yeah, one example I'd like to share is Red Cliff, Colorado. It's a old mining town just south of Vail, and there are about 300 people live in that town. And until recently, they had no broadband service at all in this town. It also demonstrates that it kind of takes a village, because it took funding from the Department of Local Affairs. They got funding from DORA through the Broadband Fund. We had to go engage the federal government. The Bureau of Land Management had to get involved. We had a major carrier who provides telephone services had to be part of the solution. And what it did, it took a community that until recently had no broadband service whatsoever to where now everyone has access to high-speed broadband. And what it's doing is it allows people actually to create and conduct businesses within that community. It also allows people to have access to, as scary as it might sound, 911 services in a different way, where you don't have to drive out of the town to go find a signal for your cell phone so you can call 911. I mean, these are the kinds of things, the kinds of impacts that it has. I think in the agricultural environment, you're going to see more and more farming take on the era of technology and what people call precision farming, where now you can be a lot more productive with your land because you're using technology and the communications associated with that to make farming more efficient. So those are the kinds of things that we're seeing, and I think we're just kind of scratching the surface in terms of what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the other important areas that broadband access can have an impact on is healthcare in rural areas. Telehealth initiatives, I think, are going to be a very important part of the future of rural areas, and really reducing costs and increasing access to quality healthcare. Some of the things that it can do is, it eliminates the need for folks living out on a farm or a ranch, miles outside of town, having to drive in and spend their day seeing a doctor for a routine appointment. For those primary care providers out in those local communities as well, whether they're nurse practitioners or they're physician's assistants, it also gives them access to specialty care providers in the urban areas to increase that level of care that they're providing their residents out there. And so as the state talks about healthcare and those issues, I think access to broadband really can play a big component through telehealth initiatives in helping address some of those rural healthcare needs.
Certainly, and as we know, the rural areas tend to really struggle being able to get the breadth and the depth of the healthcare expertise that they need to be able to service a whole community. So those telehealth services certainly, I would imagine, would be really relied upon, but then they need to be reliable. So typically, do you find that it's local companies who tend to step up, or is it the bigger companies saying we're going to do this? What is there a pattern of people in terms of the types of size of companies who want to bring broadband service to rural areas? What does that landscape look like?
Yeah, I'll give my perception of it, and I think Jordan can kind of add to it. What I see is that smaller companies who typically also have a vested interest in that community tend to have a better ability to provide services in these areas. And it's not to have a knock against the larger companies. The challenge is that the larger companies have a model that they use in terms of where I'm going to go provide services. The smaller companies have a different model, and they can tend to work on a much smaller scale and make the math work for them in terms of the population that they're going to go serve. And so I think what I'm seeing is that you are gaining a lot of interest from smaller companies that really want to go provide services in these communities. And then the co-ops are another interesting angle as well, because the rural electrics are owned by the people that they serve, and so they're now providing a new service to that same community.
Awesome. We will be right back in just a few minutes here on Connect and Collaborate. Stay with us. Be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page in the meantime. We'll be right back here on Connect and Collaborate. Hopkins, your on-air producer, and I'm excited to have with me Rebecca Laurie from the Department of Regulatory Agencies. She is the Director of Communications at DORA, Colorado. And we've been talking bringing broadband to the state, which is a really exciting subject. You know, maybe not for those of us in the Metro Denver area. We've had access to broadband for a long time, but for our rural communities, this is very important.
It's so important that we're really glad to have some of the experts in the state who are working on this very initiative on how to bring 100% broadband connectivity throughout the state. So we have Tony Neal Graves, who's the Executive Director of the Colorado Broadband Office through the Colorado Office of Information Technology, and Jordan Beezley, who's the Broadband Development Director of the Broadband Fund at DORA. We've been having a great conversation. Where we left off was, talking about some of the feedback from what's taken place over the past couple years, and if you could highlight what's the feedback you're hearing from these communities who have now received broadband service?
Well, I think universally, anywhere that you go in the state where folks prior to getting grant funding and getting this last mile built out to them, they had no service. They're just like, thank you that we really now are connected to the 21st century, and it's amazing the experience that you have when you go out and talk to the communities. And for the communities that are in line waiting, they're saying, "Oh, how quickly can we get this done for our community?" So it's just a universal excitement about it and an understanding of how important it is.
Yeah, in addition to that excitement, many of these communities, frankly, are relieved once they finally get broadband. I've had the chance to talk with many of the communities that have received grants through the Broadband Fund, and some of the feedback that I hear is that our grant program is vital to their efforts to bring broadband to their community. It's not just our grant program. Again, it's the grant programs through the Department of Local Affairs as well, and some of the technical support that Tony's office provides. But one of the key kind of factors that spans all of these communities is really that they feel that it takes a tremendous amount of effort to drive these initiatives forward, and it takes that community drive and a sustained community drive to make this happen. It's not something that happens overnight. Many of these communities, like Red Cliff that we were talking about earlier, it took them many, many years of pushing both at the local and the state and the federal level to make these projects happen.
So it's not something where communities sit back and just wait for broadband to happen. They're being very proactive about it, really, voicing their needs and then working with their legislators to try and make it work, which is what we recently saw with this past legislative session. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I think, the point that we do have to make here is that it takes local involvement. If the local community is not engaged, the most successful projects that I've seen are where you have, whether it's the mayor or a county commissioner or someone in that community who has just decided we're going to go solve this problem for our community, it's very difficult for all the other resources to kind of amass to kind of help them, because again, you need to have that local focus. And I think as a result of the two funding cycles that we've been through with the broadband board, and then also the funding that's come out of the efforts from the Department of Local Affairs, we sort of have built up sort of a bow wave of energy that was coming out of the local communities that led to Senate Bill 2 that recently passed and was signed by the governor. That was a bipartisan bill. And we were able to get it across the finish line in a very short period of time in the legislative session, whereas you look back over the history, there's been a lot of failed attempts to get this done. And the most important thing about that bill was to get a consistent funding mechanism for the broadband fund over the next 5 years to really go address this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and the consistent funding that this bill provides, it really does allow the Broadband Deployment Board as well as the providers out there across Colorado to better plan and more effectively utilize the funds that are available. Up until now, we've really had an inconsistent source of funding, and we weren't sure when the next grant cycle would be. And when you have a scenario like that, it's hard for businesses in local communities to plan for 1, 2, 3 years down the road in terms of what funding sources might be available. And so in addition just to the amount of money that Senate Bill 2 is bringing to the table, the consistency of that funding is very important as well.
And I understand that was very much a bipartisan effort to put forward a bill that both sides of the aisle really agreed with. Why ultimately was this legislation so important, though? At the end of the day, why having legislation? Why was that so important?
Well, I think again the most important thing about the legislation is to demonstrate that at the state level, we're going to put a mechanism in place to ensure that local communities have an opportunity to go get broadband deployed into their communities. And that, as Jordan mentioned, that the private sector, who has to be a partner for us for this to happen, know that there's going to be a consistent funding stream for the next several years so that I can plan and make it happen. And I think it demonstrated to everybody across Colorado how important this is for everybody to solve the problem of rural broadband.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately funding is our biggest challenge. Tony says this quite often, but solving the rural broadband divide, it's not a technology issue. We have the technology to solve the problem. It really comes down to funding. And so where this bill is really going to make that impact is it brings significant state resources to the table and allows us to combine those with private investment from the private sector as well as investment from local communities to really make a bigger impact than any of us could do on our own. And so it really helps, again, combine those different forces and really binds us together in a collaborative process that I think is going to benefit the state.
So, as we all know, it's not, the easiest process to put together a legislative bill and get it passed through the legislature. So what were some of the biggest hurdles that the legislation posed, and how was that resolved?
Well, for me, this is the first time that I've been through a legislative process. Again, coming from the private sector, I'd never really experienced this. On the positive side of this is that, again, there was a lot of energy on both sides of the aisle from the governor's office that we got to go solve this problem. One of the challenges that we faced early on was the definition of broadband. And in that definition is how I describe it is how fast is fast enough. If you have a 10 megabit, connection to your house, is that good enough? Is it 25 megabits? Is it 100 megs? You hear a lot of folks talk about having gigabit communities, and so what's fast enough? Now, coming from a technical and business perspective, I always kind of believe that you can never have enough broadband. And the analogy I always kind of use in that is that we don't think about when we walk into our home every night how much electricity is flowing into my house. All you know is you can go turn on your lights, run your washing machine, turn on the oven, everything just sort of works. I think we have to think about broadband in that context because I don't know what someone's going to do with that access once they have it. But having said that, there's also the practical realities of getting legislation through. And so we had a debate about what that definition was, but we were able to come to an agreement from all sides that the FCC definition of high-speed broadband, which is 25 megabits to your home, 3 megabits out, was what we were going to settle on as a minimum. Now, we're going to encourage anybody that's applying for a grant to do better than that. But as a minimum, we wanted to settle on that. And so that was something that we had to kind of talk everybody through and get to a resolution on.
Yeah, I want to ask, does that affect how much grant they're going to get if they push for more?
So it doesn't necessarily impact how much money they'll receive, but projects that come forward and will be offering service above that minimum do receive additional consideration from the board, and so they're more likely to be awarded funds. In the last grant cycle in 2017, the majority of our projects actually provided service that's well above the minimum 25.3. And we had several projects that will actually be providing gigabit service to rural households. And so one of the keys of the conversation with this and talking about this definition of broadband is really ensuring that we're meeting the present needs of these communities while also keeping an eye towards the future and trying to ensure that we're being responsible stewards of the state money when we're investing in these projects through both trying to to fund cost-effective projects, but also fund projects that will be relevant in 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. If you look back just several years ago, the standards for broadband were much lower than they are today. And if you only had 1 megabit at your house right now, you'd be calling your representatives and complaining. And so we need to ensure that whatever we're building out in these rural areas, again, is more forward-looking.
One of the things we were talking about earlier during the break is this idea of getting accurate data. Can you highlight some of those hurdles and how you're addressing that? Yeah.
The Broadband Fund, when it was originally created, it was designed to build out into unserved areas. And when we were originally looking at those unserved areas and trying to define which areas in the state of Colorado are unserved, we were looking at data that wasn't very accurate, and it was kind of at a very high level. And when we were working through this legislation, some of the key components and the key drivers that stakeholders wanted addressed in this was ensuring that we are both actually being able to provide service to every household in Colorado while not overbuilding and spending money in areas that are already served. And so when we were working through this legislation, we worked with a lot of the stakeholders to ensure that we could utilize the most accurate data that we have available to us today, and we could incorporate that into our grant processes. And in doing that, we actually work with the folks over in Tony's office who put together some great mapping tools in mapping unserved areas throughout Colorado. And so as we move forward in this new process, we're really going to be relying upon them as well as the providers in the local communities to, again, get really accurate data so we know where these dollars should go.
And I should note that there's a great website online to find out more information just about this initiative, and I believe that mapping tool is available as well, right? I saw a mapping tool.
That's correct. Yeah, on our website we actually have a public-facing version of that tool, but we also encourage folks who are trying to plan for grants and things like that. If they need help from us in terms of getting more detailed data that we also have, we're there to provide that resource to them.
So there was also, of course, always the talk about what is the appropriate amount of funding. This agreement about what should the funding structure look like. Can you highlight that a little bit?
Sure. At a macro level, and this is something that I got challenged with very early on, the question I was asked all the time was, well, how much money is it going to take to solve the problem? And that's not an easy question to answer because it depends on what technology you're going to use. The areas that are really unserved is if you have to go over a mountain pass, it's very different than if you're sitting out on the eastern plains. And so there's a range of numbers. But what I said was that to go address just the rural broadband issue, it's going to take somewhere around $300 million. And so if we want the state to participate somewhere between 25 and 50% of that, you have to come up with, roughly half that money. And so if you look at what we've done within the bill is really try to get very close to that number. Is it absolutely at the same number, $150 million? Not sure, because the high cost fund is a variable fund. It's a surcharge on people's voice services. So, from year to year, the actual amount that gets generated may vary. But I could quote much larger numbers too, depending on, okay, if I wanted to make sure every household in the state of Colorado had fiber to the home, that number would be much bigger. But there are the technologies that are much more cost effective, like fixed wireless types of services that can get us there. So, that's how we kind of got to the number that was debated in the bill to say, hey, get us close to this number and we think we can solve the problem.
And from the Broadband Fund's perspective and giving out grants with this money, the legislature did estimate that there would be about $115 million available over a 5-year period. That's well below the rough estimate of $300 million to hit our goal. However, what we're really doing is trying to encourage and work with the providers to increase that investment that they're bringing to the table, as well as those local communities, to try to bridge that gap and really make that money go as far as it possibly can go. And so when we're looking at these projects, we're not just looking at what's the most cost-effective project or where the best service is, but we're also looking at projects where the applicants have engaged their local communities, and they have folks that are bringing in financial investments to these projects to try to stretch those limited dollars as far as possible.
And I think that's really important because you hear people talk all the time about public-private partnership. This is the best example that I can find of it, where the public is involved, the local community is involved, the state's involved, but you also have a service provider who's trying to run a business who's also involved, and everybody's got to have skin in the game. And financially, I think that's a model that can really work because everybody wants to win. If you're going to put money on the table, you want to make sure that that project is really going to be a good project. So.
And ultimately, the skin in the game is all about economic development. In fact, Governor Hickenlooper has a quote in the Denver Business Journal, I think shortly after the legislation was passed, that he says you can't really have a discussion about economic development unless you have that, meaning having broadband. So in some ways, going back to the previous discussion, that skin in the game is all about this idea of bringing economic development or that opportunity on a more level playing field that all of us in the Metro Denver area have to the other parts of the state. So looking forward, what is then the future of all of this? In terms of, we're talking a little bit about short term. What about long term?
Well, I think kind of in the short to near term with the passage of Senate Bill 2 is to, again, get the money out the door as quickly as we can and really get these projects started and provide that broadband service to these rural households as quickly as possible to enable all of these benefits that we've talked about, whether it's education, telehealth, or economic development. And I'll let Tony kind of talk a little bit more about kind of the future of broadband and what this might mean to the state of Colorado.
Okay. Yeah, this is where I kind of get to talk about my vision for the future. One of the things that I did very early on when I took this role is I started talking about the attributes of broadband. And I used the terminology about, is it accessible? Do you have access to it? And that's sort of the thing that we've been talking about the most today. The next thing is it affordable? So, if it's accessible but it's too expensive for you, that's another issue. What's the quality of that broadband? In other words, my definition of quality is what speed do you really have access to? And is it reliable? So is it always there? Again, I go back to the days of the old telephone service. One of the things that was a commitment there is every time you picked up the handset, you had a dial tone. I can tell you today that there are places in the state of Colorado where your broadband service is not very reliable because you may only have one route into that community. And then other thing I started talking about more recently is what's the privacy and security aspects of that network as well. So if you have that as kind of your attributes and your criteria, one of the things that we're doing now is we're working very closely with the Department of Transportation, who has decided that and understand that if you're really going to support the future of transportation services and the thing about autonomous driving, you need to have a very robust communications network that services those vehicles as they're moving around the state of Colorado. So you need to have that infrastructure along all the state roads. So we really want to try to work with them to develop a vision for this that says, what is our overall critical communications infrastructure going to look like for the state of Colorado over the next 10 to 15 years? Now, that doesn't mean that the state's going to build and own all of it, but if we have a vision for where we're trying to go in terms of transportation services, in terms of healthcare services, in terms of public safety services, next generation 911 services that are going to be coming out, how are we going to make that happen? And what is that public-private partnership going to look like? And so, we're going to solve this near-term need of making sure everybody has access. But then there's all these other attributes that we have to start thinking about that we're working on. And our goal is to really have a first view of that strategy and plan by September that we can start sharing more publicly, both with local governments, with the private sector, and say, how are we going to go solve this problem together? We're doing a great job on broadband as a public-private partnership. Here's another opportunity for us to go do that.
And Jordan, how about the grant cycle? Where are things at there?
So Senate Bill 2 really set up the funding mechanism for the next 5 years. However, that doesn't start until 2019. As of today, we actually don't have funds for 2018. However, I'm hopeful that will change very shortly. I do anticipate that the legislature will introduce a bill in the last few days of the session to bring about $4 million to the fund for this year, as well as there's a dispute that's being settled with the Public Utilities Commission that could free up an additional $6.5 million for the fund. If those two funding sources become available to us, we will be holding a new grant cycle this fall, and then starting regular grant cycles in 2019 moving forward. And so very hopeful to, again, set up that kind of regular funding cycles to allow everybody to better plan projects going out into the future.
And there's a great website dedicated to the Broadband Fund at DORA.colorado.gov. You can search the Broadband Fund. There's also a fantastic site through the Office of Information Technology. It's the Broadband Office website at broadband.co.gov. Before we end, is there any kind of stories or examples of, you had mentioned Red Cliff, anything else that you'd like to highlight in terms of, you know, how these communities are really benefiting from this type of service?
One other quick example I can give is another town, Westcliff, in Custer County. They have been on a mission to improve the broadband service in their community as well. And they just recently were granted funding through the Department of Local Affairs to put in 6 additional towers in Custer County that when those towers are installed, you're going to actually have pretty ubiquitous broadband service throughout the county. And obviously there's a lot of work that has to go into making it happen. But again, it's just another example where you see a local community, you know, just fighting tooth and nail and working with the state and everyone else to go make something happen. And again, it just shows me the energy and the excitement that people have. I love my job, by the way. This is such a cool thing to be working on because everywhere I go, you know, to be able to talk about broadband and what those needs are, you know, you just get so much energy from the community when you're working on these issues. Now, the thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of anticipation now that Senate Bill 2 has been passed. It's like, okay, we're going to solve this problem, right? And we got the money. Well, it's going to still take time to go address the issue.
Sure, and many hurdles still to overcome. Definitely. So, and you said again that we're at about 77%, you said?
Yes. If you go to our website, you'll show that for rural households, which is the metric that we're using, we're currently sitting at 77%. Our goal is to try to get to 85% by the end of this year. A lot of it's going to be very dependent on the funding that Jordan just talked about. And then the ultimate goal, objective, is by 2020 is to get to 100%. And I'm confident with, you know, the resources that are being put in place that we can get there.
Great. Any other thoughts? No, Jordan?
No, I just piggybacking off what Tony said, you know, with the funding that's become available, you know, to quantify this, you know, we believe that it's about 150,000 households that we need to reach. And Tony's office is the one that did that estimate of the $300 million. But if you look at our first 2 grant cycles, it really does align with their numbers quite well. And so if we can, again, continue to increase that investment brought to the table by the private sector, I really do think that we will be able to reach this goal of 100% coverage and be able to reach all 150,000 households.
So again, to find out more information, you go to broadband.co.gov, and to find out more information about the Broadband Fund, you go to DORA.colorado.gov and search DORA Broadband Fund. Alex, thank you so much for allowing us once again to come on the show and talk about some of these really important initiatives, really key initiatives that affect not just the metro area, but all corners of the state.
Exactly. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, it's Economic Development Week here in Colorado. We're very excited to be a part of that. And, you know, this ties in beautifully with economic development. If you're going to grow an economy, you need the internet and access to that internet to be able to grow that economy. So thank you very much for joining us today on Connect and Collaborate. It's been my pleasure having you on. And be sure to like and subscribe our YouTube page for this podcast and more. Check out cobrt.com/radio-podcast. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Thank you.